What's up, everyone? Grayson the Dean 221 Nichols here, and today I'm going to be talking about bluffing with you guys. So, as you see over here, I got a little write up that I've made for my students, and this is a fun topic, honestly, because I think it's something that people are not that great at. And I honestly think there's a couple, quite simple fixes, and there are two criteria in particular that I tell my students to look for when bluffing, and we'll get to those in a minute. But some quick overview in this spot. I noticed that most novice players who struggle at knowing when to bluff and when not to, they come to me and they ask, when am I doing this, right? Like, I'm not sure, like, it's kind of based on feel, and I get it. I was like that early on in the game as well. And I think the first way to figure out when to bluff, oddly, is going to start with figuring out where not to bluff, right? And I would say that most players tend to bluff out of necessity or emotion. And what I mean by necessity or emotion, the most common emotion or necessity in these instances are when they get to the river and they realize I can't win unless I bet. So they kind of just like throw a bet out there on the table, as a last ditch bluff attempt, hoping to win the pot, right? Another example of an emotional bluff might be where you're not sure where you're at and the river presents like a scary card, like an ace or a king, right? And you decide, I'm just going to barrel this because I don't know where I'm at. So I think these are the most common examples of where I see recreational players bluff. And good players tend to pick up on this, right? They tend to call these widely. And I'll have a student message me and they'll be like, oh, how did this person call me with third pair, And I'll be like, well, maybe your bluff wasn't very effective, right? So I think, again, we start with where not to bluff. And the first spot I would mention in that would be a situation where a draw misses, right? I think those are probably the most common spots where recreational players bluff. They have a draw, whether it's a flush draw, a straight draw, and it misses. It doesn't get there in the river. And so as their only attempt to win the pot, they go ahead and fire out a bluff, right? And I think people have figured this out. I think they are more prone to hero calling in spots where the flush draws miss. Therefore, I don't think it's very effective for us to try to bluff in those spots. Now, there is an example I'm going to give later on in this little lesson about where we can bluff in a situation where the draw is missed, but that's going to be known as a value bet bluff, and that's a little bit different. But first, I want to go over those two criteria with you guys that I mentioned so we can put those into play on that example later on. So, like I said, there are two things that you need to do for a successful bluff. Really simple, right? One's a little bit more important than the other, but let's start with first. The first thing you need to do is represent a credible range. There needs to be at least 4 to 5 hands that you can plausibly represent with the line that you've taken. If you 3-bet pre-flop, bet the flop, bet the turn, bet the river, make sure there's a few hands that you can credibly rep when you take this line. I think a lot of people just fire in these spots, not really credibly repping anything. And it looks like if their opponent can put them on only like 1 or 2, credible hands, they're going to look you up. They're going to call you in those spots, right? So make sure there's about 5 hands that you can represent in this spot, and it'll be a much more effective bluff, right? So rep a credible range, a cogent range, something that makes sense with the line you've taken, right? Now, the next part is even more important, and that is know what you're trying to make your opponent fold, right? Know what you're trying to make your opponent fold. Most notably, it would be great if they have a capped range, meaning the best possible hands they can have, right? I don't really think it's very smart to be bluffing into strong ranges where people have a lot of really strong hands. So, I'm looking for spots where my opponent is capped and I know exactly what they have for the most part. When you have a good feel for what their range looks like, you're going to be able to tailor your bluff to something that is going to yield more folds, right? Most notably, it's going to help you with your sizing. It's going to help you use a sizing that will elicit the folds you want, right? So again, A, rep a credible range. B, know what you're trying to make your opponent fold. Don't just fire some wild ass bluff because you know you can't win, or you see a scary card hit and you're like, oh, I got to go for it. Be methodical. Have a reason behind it. Tell a story with your credible range, and then have a targeted range of your opponents that you are trying to make fold. In general, not with just bluffing, but in general, the better you get at ranging your opponents and knowing where they're at in hands, it's going to help you value bet better and it's going to help you bluff better. You're going to know the sizing to use in these instances, and you're going to know, just it's going to help you accomplish what you're trying to get out of your opponents more, right? So I want to explain a little bit more about what I mean by these things. So let's first start with the idea of, the first part, like I said, point one being represent a credible range, right? So what I mean by that is, if you raise pre-flop, bet on the flop, check the turn, then move all in on the river. Make sure there are a number of hands that make sense that you would take this line with. So when your opponent is sitting there trying to go through what you might have, they'll be like, well, maybe he has aces, kings, queens, jacks. Well, there's a lot of things he could have that beat me. If they're thinking like that, you're going to yield a lot of folds with this bluff, right? So again, and like I mentioned, if you only represent one or two hands, they're just not going to fold. They're like, well, if he has aces, then so be it, right? I'm just going to call. So, let's start again by looking at an example here of where not to bluff, because I do think looking at the opposite is what kind of helps me formulate a lot of my strategies in poker. If someone does a play to me that makes me fold a strong hand, I immediately think to myself on the flip side, okay, I'm going to use that against other people who think like me as a bluff, essentially, right? So an example of a spot where you don't want to bluff, right? Let's say your opponent opens in the cutoff, you 3-bet on the button, the villain calls, flops a bunch of rags, 9 high, 8, 3, 9, right? They check, you bet, they call. Turn is a 5, they check, you bet again, they also call. River's a king now, right? Villain checks a third time, and hero fires that third barrel, right? So let's take a second and talk about what we're credibly repping here, right? So again, put yourself in your opponent's shoes for a second, like I just mentioned a minute ago. And if I'm on the river and my opponent bets into me, the first question I ask myself, and you guys should emulate this, this is going to be very helpful for you when you're working on your own river processes, right? The first question you should ask yourself when an opponent bets into you on the river is, what is the worst hand my opponent would be value betting here? This will help you formulate a value range for them, and then afterward you can formulate a bluffing range for them and see which one's bigger. And this is going to help you when you're trying to hero call in spots yourself, right? So back to this hand. Let's assume the villain says to themselves, what's the worst hand that this person is value betting here? So if the board was, like I said, 8, 9, 3, turn 5, river, king, I would expect the worst hand someone to value bet on this board to probably be a king, something like king, queen, or better, right? I would be shocked if we were expected to value bet queens, jacks, or tens anymore on this board, because what would they be calling with that's worse, right? It'd be a really thin value bet targeting a 9, which people don't have a lot of those, right? So in general, I think the value betting range here looks like king, queen plus for the most part. So let's think to ourselves, would king, queen 3-bet pre-flop in this spot? Perhaps. Would it bet every single street on a 9 high board and then a 5 turn and then finally get there on the river and bet huge in that spot? I don't know. It's kind of unlikely, right? Like maybe, but very unlikely. And then the same thing would go for ace king. Probably a little bit more likely they would barrel there because I think some people get a little bluff happy with ace king, but it's still kind of the same idea, right? Like I'm not sure that the person would, bet that flop. Definitely maybe not bet that turn, right? And then when they hit the river, are they really betting huge in this spot, with one pair for value? Often big river bets are very polarizing, right? When you see a 2/3 or bigger river bet, it's very polarizing, meaning they got the nuts or they're bluffing, right? So we're going to run into these spots quite often when we're looking to hero call, essentially. So another important thing to mention here is, like I said, that's the value range, king, queen plus, right? And what's most notable about this too is that hands like tens, jacks, queens, which very much make sense to be in my 3-betting range pre-flop, value bet on a 9 high board, value bet again on the 5 turn, those hands are no longer betting the river, right? So suddenly it narrows down to like aces and kings and ace king, right? And again, we don't even know if ace king's out there. So it's like aces and kings are the only big pairs that we can really credibly rep here. Look at the other stuff, like that's also better than a king. 2 pairs or sets, right? Well, I think it's unlikely we are figured to 3-bet with 3s or 5s pre-flop, so those are out. Eights maybe, but a lot of people would just call with eights there. And then two pairs, like I don't think we're expected to have many two pair combos here. Maybe 8-9 suited was bluffing pre-flop, but that's about it, right? So if you really think about it in this spot, you're only narrowly repping like aces, ace king, and kings in this spot. And even kings might not bet huge on the river, knowing that there's not a ton for them to get value from, right? So this is a spot that I don't love a big bluff on the river because we can't credibly rep a lot of hands, right? And if you'll notice, the king was the deciding factor in this hand. If that river had just been a deuce, I think we could bluff here because now we could suddenly represent nines, tens, jacks, queens, kings, aces. That's six hands that would all make a lot of sense for us. So I would be down with bluffing in that spot. But I think the king changes things very much so in that situation. So that was a quick idea of explaining what it means to rep a credible range, right? Now I want to look a little bit on the other facet that I mentioned, attacking a particular focused range of your opponents, right? Rather, knowing what you are trying to make them fold. This to me is even more important because I think some of the opponents you're going to run into are just fun players not really paying attention. So assuming that they are reading our range well might be a big sell. They might not be reading it that well. However, whether it's a good player or a bad player, they're always going to give off tells about what their range looks like. And you being a smart studying player is going to be able to figure out hints about that, right? So I think that of the two criteria, repping a credible range, knowing what you're trying to make your opponent fold, I believe the second to be more important, right? So I want to talk a little bit about this, and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about a spot where you could value bet bluff, right? So I mentioned here that it's helpful if they're capped, but it's not a necessity. They don't have to be capped, right? But it is important that you know what you are trying to make your opponent fold, right? I think it's a really bad habit when people just fire at a spot, not having any idea what their opponent might have. But instead, I want you to have your bluff tailored towards specific portions of their range, right? There are going to be spots that I bluff knowing damn well they're not going to fold top pair, but I'm targeting maybe middle pair, bottom pair, ace high type stuff, right? So an example of that, like I kind of mentioned at the beginning, right? A spot where you could do actually a value bet bluff per se, right? Let's say you raise pre-flop with 6-7 of spades, okay? And the big blind calls, and the flop comes out Jack 10-5 with 2 spades. They go ahead and check, we bet, they call. Turn is a red deuce, they check, we bet, they call. River's the other red deuce. They check, and now the action's to us, and we're sitting here with 7 high, like shit, what do I do at this point, right? In spots like this where I make it to the river with the bottom portion of my range, I am inclined to bluff, but only if it fits my criteria, right? So let's look at it. A, what can we rep if we bluff here, if we bet here rather, and then B, what are we trying to make fold? So, we can't rep a ton of value in this spot, but I think we could still have aces, kings, queens, ace, jack, king, jack, maybe even queen, jack. We could also have set it jacks full, maybe tens full, right? So there are actually some hands we can rep, albeit specific ones, right? So that seems fine. But to the more important part, what are we trying to make them fold? And I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson that it's not ideal to bluff in spots where flush draws miss and straight draws in this instance because people are more prone to hero calling, right? So with that in mind, I think we can assume that if they have a jack, they're never folding. Hell, if they have a 10, they're never folding there either, right? They might not even fold 9s, 8s, 7s because it's a spot that just looks like you could be bluffing, right? However, we are sitting here with 7 high, right? And it is a very draw heavy board. So this is a spot I might try a value bet bluff, right? And the idea behind it is, again, I'm not trying to make a jack fold. I'm not trying to make a 10 fold. I'm not even trying to make some, pairs like between 6s and 9s fold. What I am specifically trying to make fold in this spot is ace high, king high, queen high, 9 high. All of these hands are credible draws they may have had on a jack 10 2 spade board that missed just like I missed, but they're still beating our 7 high. So say they have ace 3 of spades, ace 4 of spades, ace 6 of spades, ace 7 of spades, etc., right? If you go ahead and bet this river for about 35%, they're probably just going to fold their ace high, right? Even better, if they have king queen for a straight draw and they miss that, they're definitely going to fold to your 1/3 bet. Queen 9 for a straight draw, 8/9 for a straight draw, even easier folds, right? So while it's a little daunting that you know you're not going to make them fold really any pair for the most part here, there are tons of portions of their range that include ace highs, king highs, queen highs that are also missed draws that will fold to your bet. So you can bet somewhere around 35% of the pot in this spot, because think of it honestly, the difference between a third and 2/3 in this spot, it's nothing. They're calling you with a jack, they're calling you with a 10 no matter what. And they're probably folding their ace highs, their king highs, their queen highs, regardless if you bet a third of the pot or 2/3. So this is a spot I like to take the discount, go ahead and bet less. And this is a good example of when you can value bet bluff, essentially, right? And this is totally tailored to the idea of knowing what our opponent's range looks like. And we know there's a fair amount of jacks they might have, a couple tens they might have, but there's a lot of draws that they might have missed with as well. So I'm willing to fire a bluff in this spot, right? So I hope this helps you guys out a lot. Again, a quick review on it. The two things, the two keys to bluffing. A, rep a credible range. Make sure you're telling a story that makes sense. B, know what you are trying to make fold. If I can give you one piece of advice right now, it's keep practicing ranging your opponents. The better you get at knowing what kind of hands your opponents are going to have generally in spots, the more effective you're going to become at manipulating them into doing things that are profitable for us, right? So yeah, that's basically my quick little crash course on bluffing. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Make sure in your bluffs coming up, you always focus on those two criteria. If you have any questions for me, you could always reach out to me at gnichols22@gmail.com, and then check me out at the eliterounders.com website. Best of luck, you guys, and check out the YouTube channel. I'll be doing some free content like this occasionally for you guys that should be helpful. But again, don't forget those two keys to bluffing. I really think that if you start implementing these ideas, repping a credible range, knowing what you're trying to make your opponents fold, your bluffs will become much, much more successful. Best of luck on the felt this week, and I will see you guys soon. Take care.